Number one, it reinforces and goes over a lot of the same material that we've seen already. And number two, it kind of brings it together and helps us realize how these different organ systems are working homeostatically to contribute to balance in the body, right? How we'll have the respiratory system and the digestive system and the urinary system and things like that can all contribute to keeping pH in balance in the body, fluids, and things like that. So it's not a new system that we're doing for this one. It's just looking at various ways that we help to regulate fluids and salts and even pH in the body. Okay, so with this one, we'll kind of do it in a stepwise process. We'll look at water to begin with and what controls it, where do we store it, and things like that. Then we'll look at electrolytes, and we'll highlight some of the most important electrolytes in the body and how we control those. How do we control how much sodium we have? We see it's so important in so many different systems. How do we make sure we have enough of it, right? What's the input and the output? How do we control and vary that? So we'll do electrolytes, and then we'll finish up with pH. We'll remind ourselves about what pH is, and then what systems can help us to control pH so that we don't become too acidic, too basic, etc. Okay? Okay. So, water. The water in the body, you hear those stats where we're made up mostly of water, and that's certainly true. And we have a lot of water both outside of the cells, right? When we're talking about tubules, that's outside of cells. When we're talking about blood vessels, that's outside of cells. But the cells also have this intracellular environment, right? So when we're drawing a cell like this, and we've got a nucleus like that, right? This is extracellular fluid outside, and this is intracellular fluid inside, right? That's still fluid, that's still water-based. So there's a lot of water in the body that's actually inside of our muscle cells and our epithelial cells and stuff like that as well. So a lot of water inside the body, and the distribution of it the distribution and amount of it changes depending on what stage of life you are, etc. So, for instance, when you are an infant, you tend to be kind of a little bit different level of water compared to other stages of life. In infants, you have a fluid diet, basically. So you have lots of fluids coming in. And so your water content can be a little bit higher as an infant. You can see 73% or more of water. And then as you get older, you tend to dry out a bit. Right, so we can see in adult males it's about 60% water, and adult females it's about 50% water instead. So, and in fact, as you get older still, right, that goes down. That's when we were talking about, like, when you see people go from, like, their 60s and 70s where they have, more of a body shape that they've retained through a lot of their adult life, and then they get into the, 80s and 90s, and they get much skinnier, right? I'm not saying like a mummy or anything, but definitely they get much skinnier. So that has to do a lot with water balance and water loss. And so it just changes at different life periods. So the difference between male and female water percentages, though, generally is accepted to be having to do with a difference in the composition of fat or how much fat you have in the body. And so females tend to have a higher percentage of fat. And so we know that fat and water don't mix, so that's going to decrease the amount of water. And then depending on the individual, right, everybody's different, they may, percentage-wise, have a smaller amount of skeletal muscle. That has to do with hormones, right, testosterone and things like that, etc. And then, like we said, when we get to old age, we're down to about 45% water instead. So continually declining. So this water that we have then, if we're taking it on the left side there, we see our common distribution of water, and we can see that we're in females about 50 to 55% fluids, and then 45%-ish solids, and in males it's a little bit different, a little bit more. When we look at those fluids, most of that is contained in the intracellular environment, inside of cells. So about 2/3 of all of our fluids that we talk about making us up is inside of our cells, and then only about 1/3 of it is in the extracellular fluid, right? But the extracellular fluid is, like we were mentioning, that's where we're going to be kind of distributing that to and from the cells. So we have interstitial fluid. That's the fluid that is surrounding the cells and helping to make up that tissue. That's interstitial fluid. So there's 80% of that extracellular fluid is just the fluid that is around the cells. And then about 20% of that is the plasma that we were talking about in the last systems, in urinary system and cardiovascular system. Now there are some other areas where we can have little pockets of extracellular fluid as well. We know that there's a lymphatic system. So there's lymph, that's mostly water as well, so there's some in there. There's cerebrospinal fluid, remember that, CSF. That's pulled from the blood and created and circulates around the brain and the spinal cord. And then the eye humors. You guys remember that? You know, the jokes about eyes? So the humors, we have the aqueous humor and the vitreous humor, right? The gel or the fluid that is like between the cornea and the iris or in the posterior cavity, those are fluids. Synovial fluid in our synovial joints, that counts as well. Serous fluid, that little fluid that lubricates everything on the outside of those organs. And then all of those gastrointestinal organs. We talked about gastric juice, we talked about pancreatic juice, we talked about bile, we talked about saliva. All of those have water within them. And so that also goes as extracellular fluid and goes into our fluid balance. Now, when we're talking about these fluids, of course, it's not straight water. It's always going to be a solution. So there's always going to be solutes, and the solutes are going to be things like electrolytes and proteins and things like that. And then there's going to be the solvent. So water is going to be the highest percentage of our solutions. It's going to be the solvent. It's called the universal solvent. As a polar fluid, it's very good at dissolving other things, like other polar things, like electrolytes. And electrolytes, we'll talk about that. That includes things like our salts as well as our acids and bases. So these are charged particles that get along very well with water. So they are called hydrophilic, right? Hydrophilic means they are water-loving. And then you do get some other types of hydrophilic non-electrolytes, like glucose, right? Glucose floats around in the plasma. Lipids, some lipids are transported in the plasma, like we talked about micelles and things like that. That's in the lymph. Creatinine, and then urea, as we were saying, occurring in the tubules as we're trying to get rid of it. Now, the importance here of these solutions is that it's a mix of water as well as the solutes that's in with the water. And that gives us a solution. And those electrolytes that we are discussing in various capacities are important in their own right, but they're also always important in terms of being a force to move water, right? So when we see this sodium reabsorption, we said there's no tubular maximum for the amount of sodium we can reabsorb. This sodium is very important to us in a variety of ways and systems, but it's also really important because it creates an osmotic gradient. So electrolytes are really important to be able to pull things across. Because when we talk about an osmotic gradient, not only is it how many of these solutes do we have on this side of the membrane compared to this side, but the charges of them can be important as well, because the water molecule being charged, those charged electrolytes with a plus or a minus or whatever can affect that too. Okay. So if we have these solutions in our body, whether they're extracellular or intracellular, a solution is going to be made up of, like we said, a solvent, water in this case, and solutes. And when we look at concentration, one of the different units that we use in terms of concentration is milliequivalents per liter. And we use that for electrolytes just because, as I mentioned, in terms of osmotic gradients and osmotic pressure, it has to do not only with how many of those solutes we have, how many of those, in this case, electrolytes we have piled up in one area, but also their charge. And so in this case, a milliequivalent not only takes into account the concentration of that ion, but also the number of electrical charges on one ion. So for instance, if we are talking about sodium, when we draw it out, is like this. It's Na plus. That's like a +1, right? It has one charge. It's lost one electron. But calcium, on the other hand, and magnesium are +2 charge. So they've lost 2 electrons in their outer shell. So they have more of an effect in terms of charge, right? We're piling up positively charged ions on one side. They have more of an effect compared to sodium. And that was also the case when we were looking at like our cardiac muscle, right? When we were doing the depolarization and we had calcium flowing in, because it had extra charges like that, extra positive charge, that was depolarizing it even faster. So the point there is that our solutes that we have in the body, we're looking at balancing the water. That's really important. But we also have to keep a balance of these different solutes, of these different electrolytes as well. This figure I pulled from a different textbook. I've always kind of liked it because it shows us the 3 main kind of areas in the body where we will store water as well as the electrolytes. So on the left side, we see the plasma. So this is inside the blood, right? And here's our capillary wall. And the plasma is separated from the capillary wall, or separated from the interstitial fluid via that capillary wall. So when we are, like allowing fluid to leave the blood to go into the tissues, it goes into the interstitial fluid first, and then it has to cross the plasma membrane in order to get inside the cell, into the intracellular environment. Okay? So it's a 2-step process, whether we're talking about things going into the cell or things coming out of the cell, waste products or fluids going back or whatever. It has to cross the plasma membrane or the cell membrane to get in the extracellular fluid, in this case, into the interstitial fluid. Then it has to cross the capillary wall to get into the plasma, right? So what we're seeing here is 2 compartments of extracellular fluid, one of the blood, one of the interstitial fluid in the tissue, and then 1 compartment of interstitial fluid or intracellular fluid. Sorry, intracellular fluid there. So if we compare our 2 extracellular environments and the kind of distribution of electrolytes there, we can see they're very similar. So these are like little bar graphs, and the bigger the bar, that means more of that particular ion. So in the extracellular fluid, we can see that the dominant ion, whether we're in the blood or whether we're in the interstitial fluid, is sodium. Tons of sodium. Sodium is the #1 extracellular ion or electrolyte. And we call that a cation. Remember a cation? I always remind myself the cation is are the ones that have the plus charge on them, versus an anion, which are the ones that have the minus charge on them, right? So that's the kind of most significant cation that we see in the extracellular environment. So we have a lot of sodium out there. We have a relatively small amount of potassium in there. We have bicarbonate, you remember that, right? Bicarbonate is floating around in the plasma, transporting our carbon dioxide, and it's also similar in the interstitial fluid. And then we have chloride. Chloride is an anion that tends to follow sodium, right? It always follows the sodium that way. So let's compare that extracellular fluid. Look on the right side there, and look at the distribution of ions inside of the cell. It's almost the opposite, right? There's very little sodium inside of the cell. There's a lot of potassium inside the cell. And why is that? Because we have the sodium-potassium pump, right? So we are constantly pumping out 3 sodium ions and bringing in 2 potassium ions. And it's helping to maintain that environment that way. And that way, when our neurons and our muscle cells need to do action potentials, they can open up their other channels and allow the sodium to diffuse in and the potassium to diffuse out. But the sodium-potassium pumps are constantly maintaining that. So we see our potassium's high on inside the cells. Phosphate is high inside the cells as well. And you have a bunch of larger proteins that are negatively charged that also are stuck inside of the cell. And that actually contributes to why the insides of cells have typically a negative interior, right? They have a negative membrane potential, a resting membrane potential. It's like -70 millivolts or -90 millivolts. It also has to do with those protein anions that are sitting inside like that. Okay, so what we were seeing, like we said, is that our sodium and potassium concentrations are nearly opposite because of that sodium-potassium pump there. And it helps to maintain that external and internal environment in that particular state. We also talked about how there are other types of molecules that are in there, like proteins and things like that, that contribute both to the intracellular and extracellular environment, right? Lots of different proteins and different types of lipids and things like that in the plasma. About 90% of the plasma is from these larger molecules, 60% in the interstitial fluid, and then in the cells where we're making a lot of those, we have a lot of larger proteins and molecules there as well. Okay, so what we've done is we've kind of set the stage right now for our solutions in the body, which is made up mostly of water, plus these different solutes that are inside of it, including a lot of electrolytes. And so there's going to be this regular exchange of both water and solutes between these different organs. So we saw respiratory gases and even water with the respiratory system. We know we do a lot of absorption in the gastrointestinal tract. And then the cells are constantly exchanging with the blood and the interstitial fluid. And then we know, like we just got done, the kidneys are also helping to regulate that blood and extracellular concentration and volume. So next time what we'll do is we'll zero in on water, talk about water balance, check that off the list, then focus on some of our most important electrolytes like we mentioned, and then finish up by talking about pH. We'll do that on Monday, and then after Monday, anything we have left in that chapter to finish on Wednesday, we'll do that. And then Wednesday will be review for the exam that's basically in a week and a half. Okay? Okay. So, early morning lab people, you are free to go. If you want to go donate blood, you can get rid of some of your own fluids that way.